Hello again, everybody. It's lovely to see you. Thank you so much, Dom, for that nice introduction. I think I have told some of you already that The Eustace Diamonds is the most enjoyable of the Trollope, the long series of Trollope. But I have to confess, this is my favorite Trollope novel of them all. It's the one I would love to have edited, but it had gone by the time by the time I put my hat in the ring for that one. So this is a lovely chance to be able to speak about it. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the background, where Trollope is at in his life, what drives him to write it. I'd like to say a little bit to you about the venue in which he publishes it, which strikes me as quite interesting. And then just try to get to grips, and I'm hoping we might extend the discussion from there with what the temper of this novel is, what are its major preoccupations thematically, but also what kind of an event it feels like to be part of it. So let me start with where Trollope is at. He writes this novel, he composes it between May 1866 and June 1867. And that's significant because it's a time in British politics that is not entirely unlike the one Britain has just been through. Extraordinarily unstable and extraordinarily interesting. If you've got any appetite at all for the cut and thrust of politics, for who's in and who's out, who's leading, who's not, whether leaders are able to get a mass of support behind them enough to get legislation through Parliament, the cut and thrust and the busyness of everyday politics and how it affects the life of the country is absolutely pressing in Britain at this moment. If you have any of the Oxford editions to the novels, this is the Phineas Finn one, at the back of them is that fantastic summary of the politics that my colleague Nick Shrimpton has done. I know you had Nick talking to many of you recently. I think he did the Warden for you, didn't he? Nick, okay, good. So if you want to get into the detail of that, and he hasn't already told you recently, that would be my absolute first port of call for boning up on what you need to know of what had been happening in the period. But the issues that are to the fore are core issues of representation, of, in the small L liberal sense, liberal agendas. So who gets to participate in the political life of the country? And he has his eye in this novel, especially on, as you would expect, working men who don't yet have the franchise but who want it, who are politically literate and would like to be part of it. The Irish, and especially the case of those Irish who would like to be out from under the auspices of English rule in Ireland. And then women. So this is the period in which John Stuart Mill is trying very hard to persuade the Houses of Parliament and the country as a whole that women should have the suffrage, the vote. In 1867, just after Trollope finishes the writing of this novel, that bill fails. But it's really up in the air at the point where he's writing whether it might just go through. And I'll come back to what the women are like in this novel and how that reflects this in a minute. Now, he writes it then, and in the process of telling you this story of a young man making his way, trying to make a career for himself in Parliament, it seems to give him back that bug for the real thing itself, which he had quite often in the course of his life, and that seems to be implanted by one of his uncles when he was young, who said to him that he thought that was the height of a career aspiration for a young man, and the post office wasn't really the thing that Trollope should be doing. Okay, and that sort of grates on Trollope much of his life. At the end of writing this novel, he tries his hat. He throws his hat in the ring. I won't tell you that story in detail today, but I think it tells you something about their level of involvement and the sheer passion for the detail of it, that it gets to Trollope so much that he gives up his career in the post office. And by the time this book appears in print form, in book form, he has in fact decided that he's going to try, instead of being a post office career civil servant, he's going to try to be a politician himself. So it's a book that's extremely dear to his heart and his interests and his own ambitions above all. And it's a book that does very well for him. It's liked right from the start. The jury is out on whether it earns him the most money he ever earns for a single book, but he earns £3,200 for it. I'll put that figure in context when you've finished reading the whole, but in the context of Phineas Finn's own earning potential, that's a lot of money. And he has reason to be pleased. Where does he publish it? Interestingly, it is his first big effort at winning an audience for his own new magazine. So he starts a magazine called St. Paul's magazine, and he really wants it to be a success. And this is the novel that he pitches and writes in quite quick time, really, isn't it? May 66 to June 67, as I said, so just over a year, but it's a long novel. Not unfamiliar that Trollope writes at speed, with extraordinary dedication to the job of just hitting the desk every day and getting the pages out. And as I said, he's at this time still holding down the full job at the post office. But he really wants this to be the story that will give the magazine a profile and will attract a new audience. It's a curious thing for him to do because he's in a way in competition with himself, because he's been really closely involved with the running of the Fortnightly Review. He's been on the editorial board of that really major liberal publication. And he knows just how tricky it's been. There's been sort of infighting, difficulties with financing and so forth. In order to run St. Paul's magazine, he gets himself a really wealthy London backer called James Virtue. And James Virtue is the backer, not just of the magazine, but the person who will also fund the book of Phineas Finn when it comes out. Now, the reason for telling you all that, it's not just interesting to book historians. The reason for telling you it is that it tells you that it gives you a version of Trollope who has by now really made it in the world of London. He has had an enormously successful career. He's very well known as a writer. He's come to the end of that hugely successful Barsetshire series, and he's also written the first of the this new series, the Palliser novels. He can afford to take risks, put down the day job, the salaried position, and try his hat in the ring for the thing that he most wants to do. Politics, in other words. But politics and writing, what relation do they have to each other? Now, you can have a political career now as then, but very much more obviously in the Victorian period, a bit more capacious if you were a man and had servants to run your life, and maybe a wife who was willing to help run your life as well. Think about so many of those major Victorian figures, including two who are clearly seen as sort of Ramona Clay figures behind two of the characters in this novel, Disraeli, Gladstone, men holding down quite significant literary careers at the same time that they're being politicians. So somewhere in Trollope's head, one can think he was imagining he could run the two side by side. He could go and be a successful writer, but also be a person in Parliament. But in another sense, what this novel is all about is trying to test the relationship between having a capacity for words, for persuasion, for handling the language, for argument, for winning one's way in conversation with other people. What's the relationship between doing that as a writer of novels and short stories and the other tales and so forth that he writes, and the business of doing that with real power attached to it in the world? Now, what kind of a novel is it? In one sense, it is a very standard recognizable form. It's a Bildungsroman. So that word comes to us from the German. I'm sure it's one you've met before in this society. A story of Bildung, in other words, the building of a character, of the life of a young man, usually a young man. It's quite unusual in this period for it to be a young woman. So you take a man of 24 in this case, and classic features of that genre pertain here. So you take him from the provinces, in this case, Ireland, somewhere outside the mainstream of the main society that the major society you're talking about, and you bring him to the center. In order to do that, you have to make him leave behind his family, his attachments, the kind of, the structure in which he's grown up, and take the risk of launching himself upon the world. And the other things that are really important to the genre are that the novel seems to have the ambition of casting a light on the culture. So it's a portrait of a young man, but it's also a portrait of a society. And what it's really giving you is the rub of the two. So a young man ambitious to make his way, to imprint his character on the world, to be a success. And it's like a kind of dramatic tussle between him and the world he enters. Which of them will win? Will he succeed in making a name for himself, or will the world be bigger than him and beat him back and push his ambitions? The crucial feature of the genre is that a young man needs a mentor. Even you got to the end of chapter 14, if I'm right. So Phineas, by this stage, has plural mentors. And I don't think I'm ruining anything about the book if I say that it is in many ways a story about a young man's need to choose the best mentor for himself out of the range of people wanting to take that role. The huge attraction of Phineas Finn is that pretty much everybody, not everybody, pretty much everybody likes him. He has this great skill of making himself pleasant to men and to women. He seems to be able to charm people of any class. He just is easy to be with. And that really, it matters greatly that's why he's polarized against other men who are in competition with him for the attraction of women. Lord Chiltern, Mr. Kennedy, big, brutish, difficult, ungainly men. And yet this charming Irish, not sophisticated, just easy, someone you want to spend time with. There's a competition between the men of law, the men of politics, and the women around him for who will be the person to best guide him, to give him the best and most accurate reading of his character and help him place himself most successfully in the world. And what that means, of course, is you've got a young man and a lot of people around him wanting to live in some sense vicariously through him. The most acute form in which you've seen that at this stage in the novel is Lady Laura Standish, who is given to us as this wonderfully singular character, someone who seems in many ways masculine in her interests. There's that fantastic, I'm going to read it, we could read it if you like in detail, but where he describes her as being very feminine and yet behaves gesturally like a man, sort of leaning forward, leaning into the conversation. The lean in as the kind of great American contribution to our feminist culture, one of them, our communications culture in recent years. She does that instinctively. She wants to be part of the conversation. And everything about her body language is saying a sort of masculine presumption here. It's that facet of her and her fascination with the detail of what politics is doing that enables her to become so significant to Phineas so very early on. But you've also got a series of other people around him, from his landlord and landlady, his father, his mother, his sisters, Barrington Erle, the young man who is most in the engine, if you like, of politics and gets him on the road to his career. And then a series of mainly liberal figures wanting to guide him and make sure he doesn't go wrong. You can think of them idealistically, if you like, of people who have his best interests at heart, and they're just in competition with each other because in the way of human beings, they don't see the world alike. Their own interests are slightly different. Or you can see it more cynically as people who are all in some way using him. And then if you see it through that lens, the point about his youth, if you like, and his innocence is that he needs to learn to make choices for himself and figure out, which is the best form of life or the best route he can take. Let me say something about Ireland. By the time Trollope writes this novel, he has been back from Ireland for, I think it's 18 years. The difference, I think, from taking a young man in the provinces of England and taking a young man in Ireland is that it greatly increases that sense of being an outsider to the system, but also having something like an anthropologist's advantage of being able to see everybody without that sense of being already parti pris or, having been raised in the system and therefore having already been captured by people. He has the charm of the Irish. This is one of my favorite passages of this novel. One of my favorite trivial passages is that gorgeous conversation between Barbara and Mary Flood Jones early on. How many of you know? You don't. I can't even see enough of your faces to know, but a few people can nod. If you've ever watched Derry Girls, now on Netflix, comedy of young women in Ireland, that's Trollope doing Derry Girls before the time. It's the whole lilt of the language, that play, the inversions, and the kind of sense that there is an English Irishness that is in the ears of the English delightful comic without being patronizing is in play there. His Irishness also makes him up for capture and gives him big decisions he has to make about where he sits, because he is, if you read carefully between the lines in that first bit, he's the son of an Irish Catholic doctor, but his mother appears to be Protestant. So there's constantly a question of whether he could just be nudged and, for example, have an academic career at Trinity College Dublin, where it would not be possible for him to do that if he was Catholic. His liberal politics come under pressure because the question is whether he might be pulled over more to the conservative wing of things, the Tory party, but he's always pushing back. So he's constantly on the brink, as if being Anglo-Irish means he's neither one thing nor the other. That's a pattern that keeps playing out. And it plays out most comically of all, of course, in his relations with women, because this is a young man who just seems to fall in love with woman after woman after woman as he meets them. I mean, Mary Flood Jones is delightful and innocent and sweet, but then, oh, Lady Laura, and then, oh, Violet Effingham. And there will be more. Some of the quaintest, they are not going to be to everyone's taste, passages of the novel are when Trollope goes into full flirty older man, these are the charms of young women, what man could possibly resist her? I take those passages to be very tongue-in-cheek, because it's a novel that really has its political heart and its psychological interest primarily with those more liberal women, or those women who know that they have to make big decisions about how to secure their independence and have any kind of freedom of movement in a world that doesn't yet really allow that for them. So Lady Glencora Palliser standing behind Violet Effingham and Lady Laura Standish, all women with versions of the same problem. How do you make decisions that allow you to be as free as you can, knowing that you don't in this system really ever have full freedom? What else did I want to say about the texture of the novel? It's a realist novel, clearly. It gives you a sense of probing the motives and the interiority and the psychology of people. In the way of realism, it tells you that this is a representation of the real world, but part of the way in which it persuades you of that is by constantly showing you its hand and telling you this is a representation. You're not looking, it's not naturalism, you're not looking at the thing itself, you're looking at a writerly representation. It's very mobile. So the voice moves between high comedy and quite knotty historical political detailing of the world. Some very caustic passages, bits where he just goes nasty or snippish in the narrative voice, and you're thinking, what is going on here? One way of thinking about it is that it's like seeing the projection of a man who is moving in society and who's adapting his voice to the company that he imagines himself being in. It's Trollope's most clubbable novel, in a way. It's the novel that gives you a sense of London clubland, and Trollope by this stage belonged to 3 of the London clubs. He belonged to the Athenaeum, he belonged to the Cosmopolitan, and he belonged to the Garrick. And he turns down the offer to join the Reform Club, which is Phineas's club. But the temper of the novel is rather like being in a club room and having conversations and trying the gossipy, slightly snippy, and yet predicated on generosity and assuming you're all part of the same society and have common interests. That's very much the idiom of the novel you're in. As with the previous novel that I've spoken to some of you about, the Eustace Diamonds, there can be bits where it just suddenly throws the register and you feel you're doing something a bit different. For me, you've got a delightful example of that in the early chapters of the novel when Phineas walks through Regent's Park Zoo and looks at the monkeys. And you have first Lady, I'm going to get her name wrong. What is her name again? Lady Abigail, is it? Fitzgibbon? And then you get Lord Chiltern. And you get a sense that you are looking at creatures in a zoo, that part of the nature of society and political society is trying to figure out how these other animals are behaving. When, yes, in club world, you hope that you are all of the same kind of interest and may in a broad sense background and on the same social page. But there are times when the novel just takes its distance, as we all do socially. Sometimes parties are great generators of this kind of feeling when you just think human beings are really weird and these human beings are really very deeply weird. So the novel will just throw you into that place where you're not quite sure how to read this person. Are they friendly or are they dangerous? And even as early as chapter 14, I think you've got a sense running through the texture of this novel that certain people you've already met could just go nasty. You know, the generosity that's being extended to them may be a mistake, whether it's by women or by Phineas. And then a last thing, and then that Dom can tell me whether he wants me to talk for longer, but I'm inclined to stop here and throw the floor open after just probing this a bit. Think about the importance in political life still of caricature and sketching. And there's that special genre that if any of you have Victorian historical interests will be familiar with, the spy cartoon or caricature. So the figure of a political man, often accompanied by an image, a picture. Would it be throwing you completely, Dom, to ask you to put up that picture of I've asked Dom to just give us a glimpse. I don't have much truck myself with trying to spot who is who in the Palliser novels, but insofar as anyone's tried to figure out an original for Phineas Finn, it's this man, Chichester Samuel Parkinson Fortescue, Baron Carlingford and 2nd Baron Clermont. This is the period in which the cartoon political figuration is starting to run in parallel with this kind of carte de visite image. He's delightful, isn't he? I mean, there he is reading, sort of slightly interior, not making any great demands or confrontation with the camera, a gentleness about the figure. And I think insofar as people have been willing to convince themselves that this is, that there is a candidate for Phineas, that's why this one has taken hold. But thank you. But the novel as a whole, dealing much more with that question of what it means to assume a public profile, to be someone whose image circulates in the wider public world and who is up for discussion and whose reputation is in that sense secured. Everyone knows who you are, but also very much more at risk because you belong, a little bit of you belongs to everybody who picks up your image or picks up the latest story about you and circulates it. Oh, there is one other thing I want to say, and then I will stop at that, which is that in mapping what Trollope, to go back to where I started, what Trollope had said was really the greatest ambition for a man in the world, it says this in his autobiography, a parliamentary career. In mapping that career for Phineas Finn, I think this is why he is such a brilliant writer about parliamentary politics, really, Trollope. He puts his finger on that area of politics, which is, unless you actually have operative power, unless you're in cabinet or unless you're in one of the great offices of state where you can really make something happen, it comes down to what Phineas's father in chapter 1 calls windbaggery. It comes down to just speaking. I read a piece in the paper recently about Keir Starmer, the leader of our opposition, his frustration about just being in the speaking role and not actually having the maneuvering power, the ability to just push through your agendas. This is a novel that's fascinated by that tipping point between the young man who is personable, reasonably well educated, very, very good at talking one-to-one in society, but needs to learn the skills of managing his language and persuading others in the political world. And the big question the novel is asking of politics is, of course, also the question it's asking of the novel. Is there something of substance to this? Or is it really just in the end hot air and you're just a show? And if you take the second, then you tip over in the direction of political cynicism. But if you take the first, you think there really is a purpose and a point to being here, and things that might be achieved in a world where women don't yet have the vote and most men don't yet have the vote, and the Irish are being extremely badly handled by the English, and so on from there.